Hey everybody, John Fenn here, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org. We are a house church network. We celebrate the gathering of the saints by meeting in homes the way they did in the early church from the day of Pentecost until when Christianity was legalized in the year 300, the middle 300s AD. So for the first 300 years, they met in homes. That's our pattern, rotating homes, rotating who leads. And you can find all about us in CWOWI.org. Go to the website, sign up for my weekly thoughts, my monthly newsletter. That's where we put information on our Zoom online meetings, our conferences, and things of that nature. I really want to get into this, and I'm going to do this in two parts. So I'm going to do two roughly 10-minute teachings today, something I've never done before, to put two postings in one day. But this is part one of Christmas trees, pagans, and Christians, oh my. So in part one, I'm going to deal with two things: the issues that some Christians have with celebrating Christmas, which include bringing Christmas trees, decorating Christmas trees. And the arguments are, number one, we can't do that because of the pagan roots. And number two, it offends God. Many Christians are concerned about offending God because of pagan roots. And so I'm going to do this, like I said, in two roughly 10-minute teachings here. The first one has to do with dealing with the pagan roots part of it and the offending God elements of it. Part two will actually deal with what chapter and verse says, because Paul dealt with very similar issues in his day, and he wrote about it quite fervently, quite clearly, quite plainly for us to read. So before we get going, let me just say this. I am asking you if perhaps you have questions about Christmas, if perhaps you have been one who believes we shouldn't celebrate Christmas because of the pagan past, the pagan roots to it. I ask you to be intellectually honest. I ask you to listen to the inconsistency and the hypocrisy that can come out of standing firm on those beliefs, and listen to the larger issues of walking in love and making allowances one for another. So the arguments are that because of the pagan roots, we offend God. So let's look at that first off, about offending God. Because, Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 7, verses 3, 4, and 5, was very adamant about saying, take the log out of your own eye before you try to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So let's make sure there's no logs in our eyes when we're talking about Christmas and Christmas trees and celebrating the birth of Jesus during this time. Because Christians will rightly say he wasn't born during this time. It's like, okay, I get that. He wasn't born during this time. He was probably born in the fall. I get that. But have you ever celebrated your birthday on a day other than what your birthday actually fell on? Like when you're a school kid, did your birthday fall on a Wednesday or something? And maybe you had a family celebration on Saturday when your neighborhood kids and friends could join you. Of course, you do that today at work, at family, and everything else. You celebrate on a day when it's not your actual birthday. Of course you do. Okay, so that argument for saying, well, it's not the Lord's real birthday anyway, that falls by the wayside. Okay, so don't be a hypocrite. If you can celebrate your own or somebody else's birthday or your co-worker's birthday, on a day that's other than their own birthday, then you can celebrate the Lord's birthday any time of year. All right? No problem. You say it's not in the Bible. Yeah, that's right. It's not in the Bible. So that's why it's so petty to argue about celebrating the Lord's birthday. You want to celebrate his birthday? Hey, I'm all for that. Celebrate the greatest gift mankind's ever received. Are you kidding me? If I'm going to celebrate my birthday or your birthday or coworkers or a friend or a family member's birthday, and we're mere humans, then certainly there's nothing wrong with celebrating the birth of the greatest gift mankind has ever received. So let's set that hypocrisy aside. So now let's go to maybe it offends God. And it's offending God tied to pagan roots. I'll address the pagan roots here. Like I said, this is part one. Of part two, I'm posting two videos on the exact day. So this is part one. Then part two will deal with the chapter and verse. So let's talk about offending God. Well, let me ask you, if you find fault with Christmas trees and the celebration of the Lord's birth during this time and all the accoutrements, all the decorations and everything that go with it that have pagan roots, and you think it might offend God, let me ask you about your TV and movie viewing habits. Do you ever watch a movie or a TV that uses the Lord's name in vain? Do you read books that are full of fleshly things? You know, the works of the flesh are sexual sins and violence and drunkenness and strife and arguing and divisions. So do you think when you sit down to watch that movie with the Lord's name in vain and 36 four-letter words in it about violence and killing and sexual stuff and everything, do you think any of that offends God? Yeah, so if you are willing to accuse your brother or sister of having a Christmas tree in the house and that offends God, are you sure that you are not offending God in your viewing habits or what you look at on your phone or on your iPad or tablet or your computer screen or your TV? So before you accuse someone of offending God because they bring a tree into their house for a couple weeks a year, then make sure that you are not watching movies and TVs that use the Lord's name in vain or portray other offensive works of the flesh that would offend, would stink in the nostrils of God. So don't be a hypocrite in that. So let's look now at pagan roots. Let's go to that. You say, okay, it's got pagan roots. All right. Do you go to a building called church where you sit in rows of seats or pews that all face the same direction with an aisle down the middle, aisles on the side perhaps, and there's a platform and a pulpit area from which a pastor or minister speaks, and maybe in some churches there's an altar or maybe a table with a chalice and a plate with the elements of the Lord's Supper there, depending on whether you're Protestant or Catholic or some other charismatic evangelical whatever church. So do you realize the pagan roots of that? Do you realize that when Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 300s AD, after 300 years of being in homes, that Constantine called people out of the homes, like kicked the pagans out of their temple and called Christians to meet in these temples. And he not only did that, he built more temples in that exact same pattern, and it became known as church, having church and a church building. Because up to that point, Christianity was the only religion on the earth who did not have a building, who did not have a visible representative of their God. The cross was not even used as a symbol until the 500s. If you look at the catacombs of Rome, you look at the history and everything else, the cross didn't even come into play as a symbol for 500 years after Pentecost, because everyone's so focused on the resurrection. What you find in the catacombs are scenes of the risen Lord and the empty tomb. Today, we make it all about the cross, but to them, it was the risen Lord, that he had conquered death. And so Christianity was the only religion around without a building, without a shrine, without a symbol of its faith. And so Constantine said they needed a temple. And so he kicked the pagans out and he built the thing we've called church that we've had the last 1700 years. That's the pagan roots of that. Barb and I were taking a tour of Pompeii, Italy. And Pompeii, you recall, is the city that was overflowed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year, I believe, 79. And this Italian archaeologist who'd worked on the site for years brought our little group to a spot where there was a temple to Apollo had been excavated. And she said, notice the format, notice how it's laid out. There are bench seats that are made of stone. There's an aisle down the middle. There's a platform. There's a stone that remains where a wooden lectern or pulpit would have been. There's another set of stones that was an altar for sacrificing animals. She said this was a temple of Apollo, but you'll see that it's exactly like the church structure that we have today. And she said that's because Constantine realized that it would be perfect for housing a large group of people and having one person in charge of them. And so it's interesting that here's a secular archaeologist noting what I've said in my book, Return to the First Church, what you can see in George Barna, Frank Viola and George Barna's book, Pagan Christianity, which ought to be on everybody's library shelf, about the same thing, that the pagan roots. So if you are accusing someone of having a Christmas tree with pagan roots, then do you go to a building? Does that mean you're going to stop going to a building called church that you'll maybe now meet in homes like many of us do, like our network is about, because you don't want the pagan roots of your building? Okay, I've reached the 10-minute mark. I promise this will be 10 minutes. Hey, in part 2 here, I'm going to talk about things like birthday cakes and Valentine's Day, and actually chapter and verse about what Paul said about pagan roots of things and Christians. All right, so stay tuned for part 2.